So up first, we have Ben Knight, and the topic of his talk today is exploring the complex emergent choreography of classroom teaching and learning. This is going to be excellent. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's very nice to be here. I certainly hope that it will be excellent. I'm a bit of a stroller when I present and when I teach. I tend to wander around, but I've been given instructions that I've got to stay kind of within the range of where the camera will follow me. So I'll do my best to do that. Just kind of wave at me if you think I'm heading off piste, as they say. Okay, well, a little bit about me first of all. I am primarily an academic and a researcher. I used to be a primary school teacher, which in the UK is teaching kids from age 5 to age 11. I tended to concentrate on the upper age ranges, 9, 10 and 11-year-olds. And I was a teacher in school for 11 years before I made the transition to become a teacher educator. And I've spent the best part of the last 13 years teaching prospective teachers and future teachers. More recently, my workload involves less teaching of teachers and more research and more teaching of postgraduate research and supervision and those kind of things. But that's me professionally. I'm also a husband and a father of 2 little boys. And as I was saying to some colleagues I met just over lunch, that on Saturday morning, I land back in Bristol, UK, and my wife's going on a hen weekend. And so I'm just walking straight back into childcare with an 18-month-old and a 3.5-year-old, totally jet lagged. So, you know, you can pity me. This is a rough overview of what I'm going to cover in the talk. I'm very interested in the complexities of teaching and learning and how teaching and learning relate to one another in complex ways. And part of this presentation is going to be looking at the learning end of that complexity and that complex relationship. And then the second half is going to be looking at the teaching end and asking what are the implications for teachers of some of the complexities of learning. And in order to do that, I'm going to draw on complexity theory. And whenever I talk about complexity theory, I forgive me, but I always presume that no one in the room probably fully understands complexity theory, because none of the preeminent scholars who use and draw on the framework of complexity theory actually fully understand complexity theory. Complexity theory more or less predicts its own inability to be thoroughly understood, and certainly its own inability to be reduced and modeled, which means that even those of us who might consider ourselves to have some expertise in complexity theory are still finding our way to some extent. But I'm going to use a complex systems lens to look at the system of a classroom and the activities and interactions of those agents within the classroom and how learning emerges from those interactions. I'm going to use an example of a research project from a few years ago, and that's a small part of the presentation, really. I could spend a couple of days describing the framing and methodology and findings and conclusions of that study, because it was quite sprawling and extensive. But there are other things I want to talk about, and so I'm going to make reference to it quite briefly. I'm happy to come back to it with questions afterwards if you'd like me to drill down into the project itself. I'm going to present to you some of the findings which illustrated learning to be an emergent phenomenon, and then ask what are the implications for teachers of that. And my current interest, my current writing is primarily about the implications for teachers of the complexities of learning. Okay, so let's crack on, shall we? When I was thinking about putting this presentation together, my first thought would be, what if the title of this conference was education in a simple world. What would that look like? How would learners and teachers experience that? And I guess maybe a little bit like this. And you can see in this diagram here that these kids, or these young people, are coming into class, not knowing things. They're then being taught, whatever that means, and then they are emerging out the other end of that teaching, now knowing things. And there might be an implicit presumption here that the things they don't know are all the same. At the beginning of the process and at the end of the process, the things they know are all the same at the same sort of level, and that a singular act of teaching was sufficient to produce similar learning in each of the learners. So that might be what education looks like in a simple world. And my goodness, wouldn't life be easier if things were a little bit like that? It's also kind of dystopian though. So I'm not sure we would actually want all the things that come along with this, but anybody who's ever tried to teach a group of people anything knows that it's a very long way from this conception of education in a simple world. And I was thinking, well, what are some of the things that prevent teaching and learning operating in this rather mechanistic way? Well, as opposed to all being the same, actually learners are all different, aren't they? And they bring their points of difference everywhere they go, including into the collectives of classrooms. Their personal histories, the collective interactive novelty of operating in a classroom space, whether you're 5 years old in a kindergarten or whether you're 19 or 20 years old in a university classroom. The ways we interact with one another as learners always produce what are sometimes referred to as uniquely configured events. There's always novelty that emerges from the interactions between individuals, and that novelty is often unpredictable. And I noticed in the previous session in here, the speakers were talking about the challenges that their trainees found when the pupils in the simulation didn't respond in the ways that they thought they would. So they were experiencing that unpredictability that comes from these different points of difference, let's say. And then there's the openness of the classroom system itself. Classroom systems, whilst being fairly geographically bound by 4 walls, a ceiling and a floor and a door, maybe some windows, are in fact quite porous. The boundaries of a classroom are quite porous. Information travels over the boundary line, doesn't it? Kids go home and then they bring home into school. And to some extent, they bring school back to home as well. And we think about, we talk about complex systems as being nested. And in a typical classroom, well, a typical classroom is a nest within a school institution, isn't it? And the school institution is a nest within the local community. And within classrooms, sometimes teaching and learning takes place as a whole class, as a whole cohort together, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in dyads or triads, or even individually. And so we find that information travels across those nested levels and into and out of the classroom. And that introduces complexity. Changing cultures, which influence changing curricula over time, and of course, changing technology, something that will be talked about a lot, no doubt, over the next day or two. So all of these things and others seem to prevent this kind of simple, mechanistic, singularly causal conception of teaching and learning. However, and I'll get slightly political here, which is appropriate perhaps because the P of AMPS is politics, certainly in the UK, and I know in other comparable education systems, that despite what we all implicitly know about the complexities of teaching and learning is almost always framed in policy and in public discourse, and particularly in the media, as almost an input-output process, what we call process product driven. That's something I've written quite a lot about. And one of the consequences of that for teachers is that they are held publicly accountable for a phenomenon over which they have only partial control. And that's quite an uncomfortable place to inhabit as a professional. And in the UK in particular, the public accountability and the scrutiny on teachers as producers of learning outcomes for young people is quite high. And sometimes quite overwhelming. We currently have a recruitment crisis in the profession in England and Wales in particular. The number of young people choosing to train to become teachers is not keeping pace with the number of teachers who are fleeing the profession. And I would say that this is part of the problem. Okay. There's this wonderful quote from Jacques Derrida, and I don't know if you're a fan of the post-structuralists. I have a love-hate relationship with them, but I do think that Derrida struck gold with this particular quotation. One shouldn't complicate things for the pleasure of complicating, but one should also never simplify or pretend to be sure of such simplicity where there is none. If things were simple, word would have gotten around. Isn't that a fabulous quotation? And I think that speaks to an awful lot of what teachers experience in their efforts to elicit learning and progress and outcomes from those that they're teaching. Again, whether they're 4 years old or 24 years old. So teaching and learning are complex. And complexity theory has some interesting insights, let's say, to help us frame that complexity. And I want to just go through some of the highlights from the literature on teaching and learning. John Hattie, who's not a complexivist, he's sometimes described as being sort of like the archdeacon of what works in education. But he describes learning as being a time-worn, slow and gradual fits and starts kind of process. And I'm sure that's something that we can all relate to, either as a teacher trying to elicit learning or indeed as a learner ourselves. Donald Shon described teachers' work as operating in the swampy lowlands of everyday life. The problems of the real world practice do not present themselves to practitioners as well-formed structures. Indeed, they tend not to present themselves as problems at all, but as messy, indeterminate situations. Dole talks about teaching and learning switching from a cause and effect framing to a framing in which teaching becomes ancillary to learning. And if you think back to the previous slide and that causally mechanistic image of teaching as input and learning as corresponding output, you can see how this quote from William Dole here is pushing back against that and trying to divert away from thinking about teaching as input and learning as corresponding output. And then finally from Guanglu, the occurrence of learning is not the direct transmission from expert to novice or from teacher to students. Rather, the whole class explores problems, issues together in a particular situation in a recursive way. And it's that recursion in teaching and learning that I think anybody, again, who's been involved in teaching something will understand that teaching is in fact the process of learning as well. And that teaching isn't the starting point and learning the end point, but actually there's a recursion that's going on all the time between teacher and learner and between teaching and learning. So I find these quotations useful because they help to push back against that dominant framing of teaching as being the input and learning as being the corresponding output. And one of the things that they do is that they help us to view teaching and learning in a systemic way, as a system. They encourage systems thinking about teaching and learning rather than linear thinking about teaching and learning. Moving away from this idea of a journey with a start point and a linear end point towards thinking about learning and teaching being phenomenon which coexist within a system. And one of my contentions has been that classrooms operate to some extent like complex systems, and that it is of great benefit to teachers professionally to adopt a systems thinking approach to their own planning for teaching and pupils' learning. But I'll come to more of that later on. So complexity in the classroom reveals itself partly through the autonomy of the agents within the system. That's the autonomy of the kids. And you can all imagine classrooms with a great deal of autonomy for pupils. You might also be able to imagine classrooms with far less autonomy for pupils. And both of those coexist. Internal diversity of the classroom system. And in the complexity literature, diversity is not really used in the way that it's used in the social political literature. It's not talking about identity groups or even really identity markers or demographic markers. It's really talking about any conceivable point of difference which is likely to inject counterpoint or novelty into the interactions within the system of the classroom. So it could be personality differences. It could be mood differences, which are much more transient. It could be points of difference instigated by external factors like the weather or a wasp flying in through the classroom window. It could be physical differences between pupils. It can include personal histories and group identities, but it's much, much more than that. And the ambiguous boundaries and the movement of information across nested levels, which I've talked about already. Classrooms as systems are generally stable. They tend to have a teacher, maybe a couple of other adults as well. They tend to have far more learners in them. They tend to have a certain physical geography with different degrees of openness. But within that stability, there are fluctuations between what the literature describes as coherence and randomness. And I'm going to come back to this fluctuating between coherence and randomness, between tightly controlled teacher structure, teacher imposed structure, and more loosely governed pupil autonomy later on in the presentation. Okay. And complexity manifests itself as unpredictability and indeterminacy. And these are the opposites of that mechanistic production line model on the first slide. That was completely predictable, wasn't it? You knew in that model that if as the teacher, you always put the correct input in, what you would get out at the other end. And of course, teaching is not like that at all, and learning is not like that. It's riddled with unpredictability and indeterminacy, which is one of the things that teacher trainees have to grapple with as they head into the profession. It manifests itself as emergence and self-organization, two totally central concepts within complexity theory. The idea that with sufficient agent autonomy, agents will organize themselves. And sometimes that agent organization, self-organization, can be in the interests of the teacher's agenda. Sometimes it might be contrary to the interests of the teacher's agenda. And where there is sufficient autonomy for learners, patterns of emergence can begin to unfold across the levels of the system. So from individuals to small groups across the whole class, and in fact beyond the classroom as well. And non-linearity, which is the opposite of that linear model where teaching and learning has a starting point, a middle process, and an end point. And I'll say more about those concepts a bit later on. And in a book I'm currently writing, one of the points I've made is that learning is not a linear transmission phenomenon. It won't appear on cue when a teacher wants it to, and it may surface unexpectedly among individuals and groups. So a little bit about the project, the research project. This was back in 2019 now, this data was collected. I spent 1 week in a year 4 primary classroom in a school in the UK. Year 4 is 8 and 9-year-olds. And the whole week was dedicated to a project, learning about designing, prototyping, testing, modifying bottle rockets. So the kids were working in small groups, and built into the design of this week pedagogically was the idea of agent autonomy. So in many ways, I was attempting to occasion the conditions that would encourage learning to emerge out bottom up from the pupil collective, rather than be transmitted and imposed top down from the teacher. So to some extent, I threw those cards up in the air and then looked at how they landed. And there's some images to give you an idea of what that week looked like. The project was titled Complex Adaptive System Behaviors in Small Group Interaction, a Year 4 Classroom Case Study of Learning as Emergence. And you may have come across the term complex adaptive system, and it's not really any different from a complex system. It's just, it name checks the idea that complex systems adapt themselves. And that's one of the things that makes them different from merely complicated systems, which tend to do the same thing over and over again. And I'll say a bit more about that later on. But in complex systems, there is a self-adaptation. All right. And it's my contention that classrooms have some of the characteristics of complex adaptive systems. Okay. So what did I do? Well, I immersed myself in the classroom activity for a week, and I videoed 14 episodes of small group activity. Okay. And I also collected interview data from pupils. So I interviewed a selection of pupils about their learning. I gave the pupils an innovative self-report mechanism for identifying moments when they felt they had learned something or were learning something. And these were post-it notes, which had been slightly adapted to prompt them. And they were scattered all over the room. And the children knew that at any moment on any day, they could pick up a post-it note, write down what they felt they'd learned, what the circumstances were, what type of learning it was, how they would categorize it, and then stick that on what became known as the learning wall. And every day we had somewhere between 30 and 50 of these post-it notes on the wall. And at the end of each day, I was collecting them up and putting them together according to pupil. And I actually used those to determine which children I would then interview. The interviews were about those moments. I took field notes, and what took up most of my time in the analysis was watching these videoed episodes, which were anything from 5 or 6 minutes through to about 18 to 20 minutes long. And with that video data, the first thing I did was categorize the types of interactions between the kids according to different types of interactions. So we had procedural, discussing member roles, subject knowledge, explanations, miscellaneous, and conflict, of which there was quite a lot. That's just one example of how those were charted. And one of the things that showed me immediately was that children spend an awful lot of time talking about what they're going to do before they start doing it. They also spend a lot of time deciding and sometimes arguing over who will do what and who needs what resources. They also talk quite a lot of rubbish. Instances of what you might call learning orientated interactions, particularly curriculum learning orientated interactions, were quite slim, few and far between in almost every one of these episodes. But this was very useful because it enabled me to start getting my head into what it was I was looking at. I then used a form of social network analysis to determine who was and who was not influential in the interactions across each episode. And I used a measure of social network analysis called degree centrality. And degree centrality in its basic form is quite simple. For each interaction, for each agent, let's say, or each node within the system, you count up the number of outgoing utterances they have, and the number of incoming utterances they have. And the idea is that those nodes or those kids who have more incoming than outgoing are considered to be more influential, because the things they're saying and perhaps the things about them personally are eliciting the attention and interaction of others. Now, it's quite a blunt instrument, but as a first pass, I created a sociograph for each of the interactions, each of the episodes, showing those that were more influential and those that were less influential based on degree centrality. I then controlled for some factors, extraneous factors. So some kids weren't around very long in the episodes. They might have stayed for 2 minutes and then gone off to the toilet and not come back. And so obviously that would have affected their relative influence within the group according to the degree centrality measure. Some kids only talk to one other in the group, whilst others talk to everybody. So that I took account of connectivity as well. And also I created, and really this was quite unscientifically done, but I created an impression of the significance of the utterances themselves. So some children said very little, but what they said got everyone's attention and changed the course of the activity and the interactions in the episodes. Others just wouldn't shut up, but they were largely ignored. So there was a sort of significance / ignored factor as well. And what this eventually gave me was an influence ranking. And again, the ranking itself is not the data. Really, the process of creating and producing the rankings enabled me to come to understand what was going on in these episodes in a great deal more detail. I then highlighted the instances in each episode where it seemed obvious to me that learning was occurring or could be about to occur. And so I created 3 levels of learning incident, let's say. Potential for moments where it seemed as though the green shoots of learning may be emerging. Tangible, where it was obvious that someone or members of the group had learned something they previously didn't know or understand. And then elaborated, where not only was learning tangible, but actually there were elaborative explanations and reasoning about the learning. And I can tell you that there were quite a few of A, a handful of B, and very few of C. Now, these were unsupervised group work episodes. So there wasn't a teacher present. Sometimes the teacher would pop in and check how they were doing, but basically they were working independently as a group. And one of the things that was very clear to me was that those moments where there was elaborated learning was almost always when the teacher had popped in and said, "How's it going?" And this tells us something, this shows evidence of something that we all instinctively know about teaching and learning, which is that actually, if you just leave learners to their own devices without scaffolding, without questioning, and without prompting, without any of those teacher actions which elicit reasoning, explaining, justifying, actually learning doesn't emerge in elaborated forms. Oh, 5 minutes. Oh, crikey. Right. Okay. So there's an example of a pupil interview transcript there, and that's an example of one of the post-it notes that I used. And I put all of that stuff together to create some learning narrative, some rich description, drawing on these different data points to try and tease out how was learning emerging in these situations. And here's some of the findings. You're going to have to ask me some questions about the second half of the presentation content, because I'm going to run out of time. Firstly, the complex phenomenon of emergence. Well, it did seem as though learning did emerge from the bottom upwards, from amongst the interactions between the pupils themselves without teacher-imposed information or telling. However, as I said, it rarely it was rarely elevated beyond that kind of potential learning level. And the conditions which seemed to encourage that were the autonomy of the pupils, their own decisional capital to do and say what they wanted, their own different characteristics and dispositions, which sometimes clashed with one another to produce reasoning and thinking, and sometimes complemented one another. There was definite collision of ideas and interplay between their own personalities and the social dynamics. One interesting finding was that conflict and what you might as a teacher describe as being off task was occasionally responsible for some interesting directions in the learning, some interesting decisions which resulted in examples of potential learning. So I mean, when I was a class teacher, I ran a pretty tight ship and had very low tolerance for what I thought of as off-taskness. And I've since reflected on whether I may have been squashing potential moments of innovation or creativity amongst kids when they were simply trying to kind of wrestle with the social dynamics of their groupings or their pairings, or indeed just go off task and talk about something else, which could in fact be quite productive. Self-organization, patterns of behaviors, the ways that kids imitated one another, the ways that they challenged one another, the ways that ideas spread by word of mouth outside of the small groups and across the classroom. And non-linearity was absolutely everywhere. You would be hard pushed to watch any of these videos across the week and say that there was a starting point and an ending point to the learning, or an input and a product. It was always recursive, as Guanglu suggested. And then there were some examples of transcendence. This is a key concept in complexity theory, the idea that what emerges is more than the sum of the individual parts of the group or the collective. So the learning, let's say, which is produced from group interaction is beyond what any individual member of the group brought to the group in the first place. So something new and original is created, and there were some examples of that from the data. And where this takes my thinking is, well, if learning is emergent, non-linear and recursive, then teaching just simply can't be scripted. Teachers have to manage that complexity. And despite the complexity reducing effects and the necessary complexity reducing effects of curriculum, timetable routines, the relative stability of the people in the room, the relationships, actually unpredictability will seep through those gaps. Teaching for that reason is rarely static or inert. Teachers don't do the same things every day in the way they did them yesterday, moment by moment, day by day. They're always thinking on their feet. They're always adapting to novel circumstances. They certainly draw on previous experience, but they rarely just repeat previous actions. They're constantly required to respond to novelty. I'm probably out of time, aren't I? Yeah, okay. Well, you can, what I might do is skip past that really quickly. And
well, if we have time in the end after the questions, maybe we can come back.
Sure. Okay. I knew this would happen. I always do this. But anyway, thanks ever so much for listening, and I look forward to some questions later on.
Thank you very much, Ben. As the daughter of 2 school teachers, I find this to be very fascinating. Also, as a mother of 3 school-age boys, also
wow.
very fascinating. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I look forward to some more during the questions.
Sure. I'm not quite sure how to get rid of this. Do I just?
Rob can help us.
Okay, great. I'll just leave it there, Rob.
Yes.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Up next, we have all the way from Japan. And not jet lagged anymore. Brad Deacon. And the topic of his presentation today is Japanese university.
Your presentation on the desktop? Yeah, it says Deacon.
Through virtual study abroad.
Where are we here?
And then after that, we'll
back
come
here.
back with some questions. And
It's right there. That one? Okay. That's the one, yeah. You can just double click it, stick it up. I have to bring my glasses.
And then just so you're aware, at 3:30, we have one more session, and it'll be in the other room. I believe there's still snacks available as well, so pop down there. On education and plurality is the next session, so it also should be in the video.
Sorry, I'm just having trouble.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, apparently. Wait, let's stop sharing. Yeah.
Maybe just as he gets this set up.
Sorry, Mike.
I'm gonna kind of
Yeah,
start,
sorry.
and you can set that up when you can. So my name is Brad Deacon, but I'm certainly not the archdeacon of what works in education, even though that's my family name. And yeah, I'm actually from this area. I was born in Toronto, but I've lived in Hamilton and also spent a lot of time in Oakville. And a lot of my family is, still in this area in Etobicoke, also here in Mississauga. And it's always nice to come back, for a conference. I sometimes come back to conferences here, which gives me a great opportunity to.
Yeah, I go when I'm here, and I go slideshow, and I go.
And I went abroad about 30 years ago. I graduated from the University of Western Ontario. Some of you from this area would know that. In London, Ontario, not London, England. And,
Yeah, it still doesn't.
I just went abroad for a year thinking, okay, I'm gonna figure out what I'm gonna do with the rest of my life. And I stayed there ever since. For some people, it just, hits you like this. And I got a few questions for you before we start. How many of you are actually living in a foreign country where you were born? Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I think you'll be able to connect to some of what I have to say today. In terms of research, I'm just curious, how many of you are, doing research or you've done research that's more mixed methodology? Yeah, okay. How many of you would more identify with quantitative research? Interesting, okay. And qualitative research. Okay, so most of you are qualitative researchers, so I'm not gonna probably get too technical with a lot of the details of the quantitative aspect. The most important question before we start, how many of you are Leaf fans? Yes. All right, awesome. So go Leafs go, right? Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad I'm not like the last presenter tomorrow when everybody's like, already flown to the bars and stuff. So anyway, I'm going to be talking about something called global mindedness. And I'm sure when you hear that word global mindedness, there's a lot of ideas that come into mind. This is basically research that was done between my university in Nagoya, Japan, which is in the central area of Japan, and Arizona State University, who we have a program with, a study abroad program. And essentially, it's a 6-week program. Usually students go overseas to join this program, but because of COVID, they were given the opportunity to participate online. And specifically, they joined the School of Sustainability there, and that's what they focus on really, is they focus on sustainability, and that's what this program is all about. So just to give you a little bit of background detail, if you look on the left hand slide over here, you can see that there's a need to examine outcomes beyond L2 or second language skills. A lot of research in Japan is focused on second language development, and specifically with English. But besides that, in short-term study abroad, that's the acronym, in short-term study abroad programs, there's a need to explore a more diverse range of areas, more complexity to do with intercultural communication competence, skills for global employment, etc. And the majority right now of the programs are university to university exchange agreements, about 2/3 of them. And if you look over here, this is from a company called JASO. There is a majority of students that study abroad for less than 1 month. So they're very, very short programs, but there's far fewer students that are going abroad for longer periods of time. So to develop these kind of skills, students really need the opportunity to interact with other people. But as you know, Japan is an island country, About 98% of it is homogeneous with Japanese people, and it really limits their opportunities to interact with others. So that's what they need, is these opportunities which study abroad can possibly give them. Here's the definition for global mindedness, which you guys can read. And this actually comes from a lady named Het, who did her PhD research on designing an instrument to measure global mindedness. And that's the instrument that I used in this study, which I'll be talking about. So just to give you a little bit of background, existing studies that are on this are largely limited to case studies and subjective accounts. So there is a need to investigate global mindedness more with quantitative instruments, and to combine that together with some of the qualitative data that we do collect. And especially there's research that's needed within short-term study abroad contexts, including the one that's in the study. So the objective of this study, as you can see here, was to assess the effects of an online short-term study abroad program on Japanese university students' global mindedness. And the research question was specifically looking at the impact, what it was of this program on the global mindedness of the participating students. The students were sophomore university students. I'm not sure how many people know CEFR. You've heard of this, the different CEFR levels. Basically an intermediate level of English. That's what this level refers to. We had an experimental group and a control group. And approximately a third of the students had been abroad before, had never been abroad before. 1/3 had traveled abroad for a short period, and 1/3 had studied before or lived abroad. So there was a diverse range of experience within these students. And again, it was a 6-week online program. It included 5 days a week, 3 hours of classes, and they had an independent research project. And the courses were all conducted by the Arizona State University teachers, which was for the experimental group who participated in the program. The control group were the remainder of the students that were staying in Japan. Well, they were all in Japan, but they were in the regular program at our university. And we used not only just a pre-post, but we wanted to use a pre-post and a post-post design to look at not only what were the immediate effects of the program, but did they continue over time or not? So we used Qualtrics to collect our data, and we translated the scale into Japanese. There's 30 items in the scale, and it was also back translated. And just again, interestingly, a lot of these instruments that we use are very much Western-based. And that's one of the challenges that we have in other cultural contexts. I'm actually a qualified administrator for the IDI. For those of you that might know that, the Intercultural Development Inventory, which is a very well-known and used instrument in the field that has been proven to have cross-cultural validity. But this instrument really doesn't. So we wanted to test this instrument to see how effective it was or wasn't in our design. And we used Stata, which is somewhat similar to SPSS, to examine what was going on. So basically the instrument itself, it measures their attitudes related to these areas especially. And even though it says behaviors, I don't think it really measures behaviors. I think it's more about their attitudes and their intentionality versus the actual behaviors that are equated with the definition. Het created a 5-factor model which included these areas. Just for your interest, I ran something called exploratory factor analysis, which some of you might know, and that revealed that in our context, it actually had a 2-factor model, and the number of items was reduced from 30 to about 16 because of the different loadings and how appropriate they were. So that was run after all this data was collected. All right. So these are the basic results, quite simply from descriptive statistics. You can see here, the scores can range from 30 to 150. It's on a 5-point Likert scale, 30 items. And you can see the experimental group here, the ones that participated in the program, The mean was about 110. So that was their mean. And the control group was also about 110. So they were basically at the same level when we measured them before they participated in the program. This was time 1 before. At time 2, which was the post, you can see here that the experimental group shot up to 121, and the control group also went up very, very slightly. But interestingly, at time 3, which was 6 months later, and then post, what had happened is the experimental group had dropped back down to almost the same level as the control group. And what this partly reveals is they came, after the program, they really had a desire to interact more with, international students and stuff like that, but they didn't have the opportunity because of COVID. So that's one reason to explain the limitation here. We also did not sustain online, collaborative online interactive learning with other parties at Arizona State. So they didn't have the opportunities really to continue that. And just graphically here, this illustrates all the changes. So you can see again, this spike from time 1 to time 2 for the experimental group. But again, it just kind of drops down after the 6-month period. And they're pretty much the same at time 3 and also at time number 1. All right, I'm probably not going to go into this stuff too much. I wrote a paper in the Journal of Virtual Exchange. If anybody really wants to dig into numbers and stuff like that, I will, direct you to that paper. But most of you are qualitative research, I think. So what we're going to do is say sayonara. That's not hard, but okay. So we'll get into the qualitative data. We did some study abroad surveys that were open-ended before the program, and I conducted some semi-structured interviews as well in a post design. And we used Max QDA to analyze this data, myself and one of my colleagues. And one of the themes that we came up with is students have a conceptual awareness of global mindedness. You can read quickly some of the comments from them. So P represents participant, I means interview, and S means from the survey. That's where the data came from. So again, they did have a conceptual awareness of what global mindedness is. And they also had a sense of the importance of global mindedness as well. Here's some of those comments really quickly. The third theme here is, interestingly, their primary reason for joining the program was to improve their English skills, right? And you can see quickly some of these comments here. Okay, and I'll just very briefly comment on this. The Japanese government has a phrase called global jinzai, or global jinzai, which means for global human resources. I saw a bit of that this morning in the talk. So there's 3 main factors that they're pushing. One is helping, focusing on developing language skills, right? Again, language in Japan, mostly means English. The second thing is more like intrapersonal or interpersonal skills, such as cooperation, assertiveness, etc. And the third one is about culture. So it's about, understanding not only other cultures, but also their own culture better. And these are things that are being focused on to help them to, function more effectively in, the so-called global arena. But students mainly just focus on the English. They don't focus as much on the culture. This could have partially been because it was an online program. If this data was collected after actually physically being in the States, it might have been different. And the last one here is this. Again, there are a few endeavors that they are actually taking to develop their global mindedness. The first one here, they say, I might get involved here, right? Or here, I don't have concrete plans, but I'd like to go abroad. I don't have a specific plan, etc. So some of them have like intentionality, but they don't really have a kind of clear plan of what to do sometimes. Or they might, espouse that they want to do something, but do they actually do it or not behaviorally? That's one of the challenges that need to be tracked, actually. The last one here is this idea that students need models, right? This morning, the one gentleman, I forget his name, but he was one of the speakers, the students downstairs. I thought that was fantastic, you know, that idea of having a student actually talking about the program. What a phenomenal, like, you know, role model to, you know, first of all, get up on a stage, you know, with some pretty heavyweight people in the field, right? You know, and still, you know, be able to communicate and share his ideas, which he's an expert on, right? He's an expert of his own experience. I thought that was incredibly effective. So these are the kind of models that students need to develop more. So very briefly, some of the implications from this study, and that, by the way, is my university in Japan, Nanzan University. Very small compared to this place. But online short-term study abroad programs can facilitate the development of global mindedness. So we did notice that through the data. But in order to sustain it, we need a more focused pedagogical approach. So, you know, we as teachers and organizers need to look at other ways to continue this development and, you know, support students in various ways once they come back. They have a lot of agency, but they sometimes need that push, and they need to kind of, you know, understand more what to do. That's one thing I was asking that gentleman downstairs after, like, how do you get involved here, you know, in Sheridan, and how do you know, where do you find out about stuff? Like, that's really interesting for me, because I always like to get ideas from other places like here and understand how that goes. So if you're here or you have ideas, please get in touch with me, and I'd really, really love to dialogue with you either here or online or something else. Okay, just to finish up, this is part of a grant and aid by the Ministry of Education in Japan, which I'd like to very gratefully acknowledge, especially because of the price of flights and hotels and conferences and everything else that we have to pay for. So that was very generous to support this. And I'd like to say thank you. That's my email for contact, or if you want the article that I mentioned. And I think that's just about all the time I have. So thank you very much, everybody.